How do you feel about Aug Evoker, Ellie? So for those who don't know, Ellesmere has been playing a composition that doesn't run with an Augmentation Evoker, which is actually pretty counterintuitive to what you're seeing like on the rest of the top of the leaderboard. They're playing a comp they call it God Comp, which is a joke, but they've been playing double mage outlaw rogue a lot. So like how are you feeling about the no Aug? Like what is your read on that?
Well, here's basically the thought process. And the team hasn't necessarily agreed over this season on that, on Aug specifically.
Yeah.
Me, Nerf and Fu have all talked about the value of Aug in terms of both healer power, tank power, in a season that is often not gated by timers, right? Like this season, timers are really like when you get to the very highest level, timers become slightly more of a factor, but even then, it's like, okay, so what you gain from not running an Aug is you gain more damage, right? Like a comp with that, like Aug definitively does, well, okay, that's actually also slightly debated because it's really hard to analyze exactly how much damage Aug is doing because a lot of the hooks are broken. There's not enough support on the log end.
Right? Yeah.
So it's really hard to like go into these keys and really analyze. And then also like Aug scales differently with different specs, right? Like Aug benefits some specs more than others. And so one of the things that, when we talk about God Comp with the double mage rogue, the idea is that the Aug is generally there to support the other specs. But if you can play a full set of specs that don't need support, then you can instead go for like maximum damage, which was basically our concept behind the God Comp. Because both mages can live every one-shot mechanic, monk can live every one-shot mechanic, and rogue can live literally everything.
Yeah.
Double mass barrier is huge too.
Double mass barrier is huge. Mages are super tanky. Rogue's super tanky. So basically, we just ran a comp where like it was kind of like everybody could just survive everything, and then just slam through keys with, But we did run into some issues with tank survivability, especially because not having an Aug, you lose Cauterize, you lose a second Dispel. Places like Darkheart Thicket, the first part, I was literally the only poison Dispel, and we would be pulling like 2 cats and 3 poisoners, and it would just be complete chaos because you're lacking you're lacking the Cauterize for the cat leads. You're lacking. We ended up all going dwarf except for me, and the dwarfs did help. But again, that's a 2-minute cooldown, and the poisoners put out poisons like every 6 seconds. So Darkheart Thicket was especially frustrating. And then tank survivability in places like Everbloom and Waycrest, where there's just like a lot of really hard-hitting mobs and you have to pull really big. It became problematic and was definitely a source of frustration with the team because, me and Nerf were both having to compensate for not having an Aug, right? Like I was having to do way more healing. Nerf was having to do way more personal survivability because we're just lacking like so much extra safety from like when you've got an Aug not only giving the healer and the tank main stat, the tank gets blistering scales, which is huge for armor. And then on top of that, you have the verse buffs going out constantly for the whole team, which is just blanket DR. So and then you have, max health for the whole team, as well as stuff like Zephyr on a 2-minute cooldown, which is super powerful for certain mechanics. Basically, we sacrificed a lot of group survivability in a season where it seems like the emphasis should be on group survivability, which is part of what caused frustration. And which was part of why I don't necessarily think that like Double Mage Rogue is the God comp. I do think that it's a really good comp and it's competitive. Yeah. It's just hard to say which is better, right? On the one hand, you have a comp that will definitely be faster timer wise if you execute perfect because you're not playing Aug, and there is a fair amount of evidence that Aug was not outputting the same level of damage as a triple DPS comp.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, you're sacrificing a lot of group survivability for that, and especially putting a lot of pressure on your tank and your healer to basically, Yeah. So I don't know. That it's complicated. I think AUG is very good, but I also see the other side of it where it is true that typically when you look at these runs, teams that are not playing AUG are faster. But yeah.
I did think it was really interesting watching your comp play compared to the other, like, I think, which is the meta now, the Boomkin Mage, AUG, Priest, Healer comp. And I feel like the AUG comes back online with, like, normal damage numbers when a Priest is reintroduced into the comp. I feel like that's been the big missing part for a lot of groups this season that are playing Mistweaver, where AUG doesn't have a PI to align its cooldowns with. If you have a strong PI on, like, a Boomkin, for example, plus an AUG at the same time, that is a lot of damage.
I feel like Moonkin needs AUG to be successful because they're otherwise just going to die. But you don't line up your CDs with the Moonkin whenever you're playing the AUG. You're lined up with the Mage the entire time.
Well, I mean, you still PI the Moonkin.
Oh, yeah, you're PIing the Moonkin, but the AUG is synced to the Mage with Eons, right? Moonkin just does a lot of damage.
You're still PIing with Eons, right? So.
Okay. Yeah. Sure.
So my point is, like, I think that's the closest you can get to the double Mage Rogue damage. At least,
well, yeah, and that was part of it. Is that we were pretty convinced that, like, Rogue was it, like that Rogue was really, really, really good. But the thing is, Outlaw Rogue does not work well with AUG. Those do not, they don't synergize well at all.
Yeah, its damage profile is so flat.
Yeah.
Same with the mages, honestly. Like, well, they're a little bit more bursty this season, but for the most part, mages are pretty flat too.
Moonkin has an incredibly flat damage profile too.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just like we were looking at logs, and I don't know what it is specifically. I don't know if it's like Outlaw doesn't scale well with main stat, or like they're already stacking verse so high that their verse from the AUG is getting DR'd. I have no idea. But every time we looked at logs, we were like, okay, AUG plus Rogue is not good. Like, the AUG is losing so much damage because of the Rogue. It also could have just been hooks being trash, which is highly possible. But yeah, in general, it felt like AUG plus Rogue was not going to happen. And we felt like Rogue was really, really, really good. And obviously we had JPC, who's like the best Rogue in the world. So it's hard to not want him to play Rogue, especially when he's like pumping insane numbers. And Rogue is just infinitely survivable. You know, it never dies. So because we were playing Rogue, we were kind of like, okay, we're not going to play AUG as long as we're playing Rogue, because whenever, and then the other thing is, like, if you have AUG plus Outlaw, then on big AoE packs, like, the Outlaw's target capped, and then AUG is just amplifying the target cap. So you're just lacking like so much AoE damage on these big pulls if you play that comp. You're basically running 2 DPS instead of 3.
I think people really underestimate like how much Bring the Player matters for this season. I feel like
oh yeah, for sure.
There are a lot of classes that can fit pretty well. Like, you can like play some decent like 3 DPS compositions if you kind of work around it, trying to figure out like what works together well. But man, if you bring in good players into the fray, like, your success rate is going to go up like a significant amount, but like just by playing with better players, because they're going to make less mistakes. They're going to have fewer deaths. A lot of the times, unless you're actually doing a 31, the timer should be fine.